ప్రొఫెసర్ ముతాట్కర్, శ్రీ పద్మనాభయ్య గారు, శ్రీ అచలేంద్ర రెడ్డి గారు, డాక్టర్ పద్మ గారు, distinguished scholars of the dais, friends. After 2 days of deliberations in different sessions, the task is not going to be easy for me to speak about tribal policies in this last session. Before this session, I had 2 observations made by Sri Chenavirabhadrudu. He was mentioning about some references that whether there is a need for tribal policy, what is the use of tribal policy, because the policies are not being operationalized or implemented properly. There is no need for tribal policy. He is referring to somebody else. Then the question also is whether there is a tribal policy, because if we want to look at a particular document that this is our tribal policy, there is no such document. We have only draft that is in incubation or cold storage or whatever it is. And also very appropriately, the seminar is titled as Tribal Policies. And this is very correct because I think that we have different kinds of problems for different kinds of tribal groups. Central India, Northeast, there's a lot of contrast. PVTGs within the mainland, PVTGs in Andamans, nomadic tribal groups, dispersed tribal groups, ex-criminal tribes, different problems, plains tribes, hill tribes and forest tribes. So we know that uniform policy is not going to work. There has to be policies. Of course, we are also talking about policies in terms of health, education, and all these things. So if there is no policy document which was approved, then the policy guidelines or directives come to us from the Constitution. We talk about 5th schedule and 6th schedule. Then various important legislations that were made reflecting the policy of the government. Constitutional provisions and legislations together were actually reflecting the policy of the government. And what is the vision of the Constitution? I would like to quote from the first meeting of the Constituent Assembly, where Sri K.M. Munshi made a statement, I quote, "We want the scheduled tribes in the whole country should be protected from the destructive impact of races possessing a higher and more aggressive culture, and should be encouraged to develop their autonomous life. At the same time, we want them to take a large part in the life of the country adopted." This is K.M. Munshi in the initial discussions of the Constituent Assembly. So we can see the concern in those days. The concern is protection. Protection of the vulnerable sections, and then helping them to be part of the mainstream of the country. Now I mentioned that 5th schedule, 6th schedule, and then other provisions actually reflect. We also mentioned about tribal Panchashil, and then we also heard about new Panchashil that is actually required if we really want. Now Jawaharlal Nehru mentioned that we have political integration, but what is required is a psychological integration. People also spoke about emotional integration between the tribals and the rest of the population, because those were the concerns in those days about the tribal population. So integration of the tribal populations. Now what are the other concerns in those days when we started our efforts towards integration of the tribal population? We have a series of committees and commissions. Elvin Committee, Devbhar Committee, Shiluo Committee, then Renukare Committee on backward regions. So there were actually different kinds of commissions, but the recommendations of all these experts are focusing upon either preservation of tribal culture, making use of tribal institutions, instilling among tribals a sense of confidence and self-respect. Most of the emphasis was upon consent, initiative, involvement, and felt needs of the tribals. But is protection only concern? We should also remember that the 5th schedule and 6th schedule areas are not a new innovation in the Constitution. They are a continuation of the partially excluded areas which were converted into 5th schedule, excluded areas in the 6th schedule. So those areas which were prone for unrest in those days were excluded from the purview of normal administration or regular administration, and then they became the 6th schedule areas, and partially excluded areas became the 6th schedule areas. So the concern has been integration and development in view of the unrest or apprehensions that were there at the time of independence. Now, we discussed about the governor's powers, legislative powers, and then they are not used anywhere the way in which the Constitution intended them. And we also discussed about the role of tribal cultural research institutions. But one thing I think we missed is discussing the role of tribes advisory councils, TAC, which is also very important constitutional provision. These TACs are also almost defunct. The TACs are supposed to advise the government on welfare and development of the scheduled tribes, but sometimes they are even hijacked in order to get approval for legislations that were anti-tribal. For example, in Andhra Pradesh, the TAC gave an approval for relaxation of LTR land transfer regulation 1 of 70 so that non-tribals are exempted, and then 5 acres, 10 acres, wet, dry exemption is given to them. This was approved in the TAC. And the TAC actually, all the people who supposed it are from plains areas, not from the hilly forest areas. So there is the role of TAC has to be discussed and debated actually. It has to function more regularly. Because in some of the legislations, TAC has been given importance. The TAC should be consulted for mining projects, industrial projects where displacement is involved. But what is happening is mostly the consultation or consent is at the Gram Panchayat level, Gram Sabha level. TAC level, it is bypassed. Now we found that from 1988 onwards, there was a kind of paradigm shift. Lots of expectations about this paradigm shift. 1988 forest policy talked about joint forest management. See, I thought that I have 20 minutes time according to the... Anyway, I will be brief, sir. I will not, at the fag end of the seminar again, going into history and all these things is not required actually. All the learned audience know all these things. See, paradigm shift in terms of participatory approach and JFM, then PESA Act 96, National Policy on Resettlement 2003, Draft National Policy 2004, again 2006 when the government had changed, then Forest Rights Act 2006, then Land Acquisition and Rehabilitation Act 2013. So we see all these things are actually a significant steps in tribal development and tribal welfare. That is why we thought that it's a kind of paradigm shift. But 2 draft policies were there, and then we have discussed them. 2004 policy has been ruled out, saying that this is assimilationistic. 2006 policy has very rigorous recommendations about displacement and rehabilitation. So both of them we have discussed and debated in seminars like this, and then they are still lying. 2006 policies still not seen the light of the day. Now, one thing is, whatever legislations that were there, I'm talking about 3 legislations, PESA, Forest Rights Act, and then Law Act, Land Acquisition and Rehabilitation. In all the 3, there is one thing which was given lots of importance, that is the Gram Sabha. Though there are different definitions, Gram Panchayat, Gram Sabha, in all the 3. But we have to discuss actually or understand what is the position of this Gram Sabha or Gram Panchayat or Panchayat Raj institutions. what kinds of powers are given to them under PESA, and what is actually practical, what are their finances, and then other provisions. Then I don't want to go into the details. Maybe I will shift to the developmental aspects. We have seen number of strategies, programs. We discussed about ITDPs and all that. And there are a number of strategies and then programs. Top-down approach, regional planning, area development approach, participatory approach. All these things were implemented, starting from multipurpose blocks to ITDPs, MADA projects and all these things. But what has happened? The policies and legislations are there. They're all pro-tribal, but there are contradictions. There are actually implementational problems. Governors, TSC and all these things, I need not actually repeat other things. More recently, we have another high-level committee report, the KAKA report, which is also has not seen the light of the day. It also has very rigorous and then contentious kinds of recommendations that were made. It also criticized very critical of government's role, especially in displacement and rehabilitation. So that is also not actually out. Then the tribal sub-plan started with high expectations and emerged as a mechanical mixture of funds from different branches of government, which do not add up to a coherent plan or sub-plan. Sub-plan is actually supposed to be coherent, and then there are a lot of financial integration, program integration, area integration, integration between tribals and non-tribals. There are fourfold integration which is part of the sub-plan approach. But what has been actually achieved in the sub-plan and then this integration again? But what is happening? We are talking about minimum needs still. The Ministry of Tribal Affairs still talks about development deficit and then areas lagging behind. In its website itself, it says that there's a development deficit with very slow progress over the past few decades. This is the website actually. Now, in the whole seminar, there are two strands. People are speaking in two languages. One is the stand taken for development, urbanization, industrialization, urban amenities, Pura, and all these kinds of things. The other language is about rights over resources, alienation, deprivation. So how to strike balance between the two, the development and also the resource control and then access to resources or ownership of the resources of the tribals. I think this is the issue that is there before us, which has to be reconciled when we actually propose the recommendations on the tribal policies to the government. Thank you.